Okay, everyone, it's Hillary here, and for We Are Triathletes, and I'm here with Mike Monastero. Did I pronounce your name correctly?
You did. Well done.
From Babylon Bikes, and Mike is going to talk to us today about power meters, bike fitting, and some other stuff that relates to bicycles. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce you to Mike. And Mike, just give us a little background about yourself and what you do at Babylon Bikes and also on your side jobs.
Sure. So I've owned Babylon Bike now for the 27th year. I've been coaching cyclists and triathletes and runners for about 15 years now. That's kind of what brought on the interest in training with power. I'd been a bike racer since, well, really the mid 80s, and had read a lot about some of the best professionals training with power meters. And at the time, they weren't affordable. Power meters were all, $3,000 and $4,000 each. But at the time, a company named eTune was making a hub-based power meter that was able to break the $1,000 barrier. So when that became reliable, I bought one and sought out as much information as I could on training and racing with one on the bicycle. At the time, there weren't many people that were really using these except for very high-level professionals, and very few folks even at the Olympic Training Center were still using them. Were using them at that time. So traveled around a bit. There were basically two guys that were talking about it publicly. One guy was named Andrew Coggin, and anyone who's familiar with power-based training knows his name. As a matter of fact, the training levels are named after Andrew Coggin that were defined by him. A lot of the training software use terms and metrics that he devised from his research. So I'd go wherever he was talking and I'd just pick his brain, joined a couple discussion groups with a very small number of people that were using power meters, and it kind of blossomed from there. Some early triathletes adopted the power meter, as triathletes often do, long before cyclists adopted new technology. Triathletes used aero bars long before bike racers did. Now you watch the Tour de France and the time trial stages, everyone would think to do a time trial on the tour without them. So some triathletes approached me to train them with power about 14 or 15 years ago, and had to learn a little bit more about the running and the swimming at that point, just to be able to kind of figure out the training stress and to be able to plan their training in all three sports.
So talk to me a little bit about the power meter.
Sure.
Why should someone go out and buy a power meter? I mean, they still are pretty pricey.
Yeah.
Does it really make a difference?
The thing with a power meter is it kind of gives you that independent variable, that intensity. People, when they run, when athletes run, and when athletes swim, it's very easy to look at your watch and see, how fast you coming in on your 50s or your 100s in the pool. How fast are you running around the track? When you do a measured distance, how fast are you going? On the bicycle, it's very different because so many things affect your velocity. It's very difficult to use that out on the bike. You can't just train by mileage. If you do a very hilly ride, you might go much slower than you would on, say, on a flat ride, but you clearly were working a lot harder on the hillier ride. The example often I use is, we have a training area. A lot of people ride here on Long Island called Heckscher State Park, and it's about a 3.8 mile loop, and it's very windy in there. On some days you might go in there and ride a lap at 150 watts, and it might take you 14 minutes. On another day, you might go in there and ride 150 watts, and it might only take you 13 and a half minutes. So, one might infer from that one ride was better than the other because it was faster. When in reality, the effort was the same. You went just as hard. So the power measurement really gives us an independent variable that we can base our training on. It enables us to see, exactly how hard is hard. Are we improving? When we're doing like certain intervals, are we getting more powerful? And then what I think one of the best uses for a triathlete is it helps us sort of govern our effort in the races. there's a certain power output that you should hold, and you kind of figure that out based upon your training so that you're still able to run very well off the bike. Because there really is, there's an expression people get tired of hearing me say here in the shop, or athletes that I work with, is there's no such thing as a good bike and a bad run. The bike has to set up the run. If you're not running well, you're not going as fast as you can. You have to protect the run.
Interesting. So now I know that there are different types of power meters out there on the market. Some of them go on the cranks, some of them go on the pedals. Can you talk a little bit about those and what makes one better than the other to purchase?
Sure. So, as you suggested, there are a number of different places where you can accurately measure power. Probably the original one was in the crankset. That was the company I talked about, 15, 20 years ago. It was the only game in town. It was a company called SRM. It was a German company. Their patent expired several years ago, and there have been a lot of new entries into the crank-based power measuring devices. Quark makes them. PowerTap makes them now. A company called Power 2 Max makes them. Stages makes one that's left side only. The advantage to those is that regardless of the wheels that you use on your bike, whether you train with a training wheel and then race with a racing wheel, the power meter is not in the hub, so that you don't need to have two separate power meters. And the advantage to the crank-based one over the pedal system is not all pedal systems offer the power measuring option. So unless you're someone who uses a look-style pedal, you're not going to be able to use like a speed play or some of the other power pedals that are out there, other pedals that are not power ready. If you're someone who's used to using Look Kios or Shimano SPDs, you can use something like the PowerTap P1 or the PowerTap P1S pedals, or to some extent the Garmin Vector pedals also.
Mm-hmm.
And then really the last place was really the first place that they became affordable was in the hub. But that requires that you use a separate wheel when you race that you have to have another power meter for if you want to use it for pacing.
I know that using different gadgets in comparison with the power meter, you get a different reading. For example, I have the Garmin Edge 1000, and it will say that my power is X, but my Garmin 935 will say something different. Or if I'm on Zwift, it'll have a different power, reading. So what in your opinion is, should I be using, or should we be using?
Sure. So that's a really great question. I think there are two issues really. The first one is, why are you getting different measurements on the 1000 and the 935? And oftentimes that's an issue of how you have the settings set up on your Garmin. So if you're setting up the Garmin 1000 to record at a different recording rate than you are on the 935, the way it's taking the data is going to report it differently. So you'll get some fluctuations in the readings between the two. But if you have your firmware updated on your power meter and also on your Garmin's, and you have that recording rate set at an equivalent sampling rate, you should really get the same measurements. The other issue is when you talk about Zwift, Zwift is really estimating your power output based upon an algorithm that is a function of the resistance of your trainer and then the speed and what other input you put in as far as your weight. So it's more, the Zwift is less accurate. It's estimating your power, whereas the power measuring devices we talked about before, things like the PowerTap pedals or the cranks or the hub, those things are actually measuring it. So, if there's a conflicting number between the Zwift and your actual power meter, trust your power meter. That being said, power fluctuates quite significantly inside and out for some people. You don't have as much inertia inside as you'll have outside. So a lot of people find holding power as high as they will outside difficult inside. Plus, you have this heat element when you're training indoors. Even with a big fan in a very cold room, there's still a great deal of heat that you're giving off which really significantly increases your perceived exertion. And for many people, most people, makes it more difficult to hold as high a power.
Now, getting back to a Zwift or a CompuTrainer or any of those smart trainers, as you will, do you think that they simulate real environment? I mean, is it good just to use those? And I'll give you an example. I had talked to someone from New York Roadrunner, and the head coach there had told me that, being on a treadmill, you could just practice the treadmill and go out and run the New York City Marathon. You don't really need to be practicing on the street. I mean, how would you say that a smart trainer compares to riding on the street?
I think in the ways that most people probably think, they're quite effective. Like, I think riding a smart trainer on a specific course that you're going to race on is a great training exercise. These things have gotten so good at simulating the undulations in the road that riders that go away especially to places where they couldn't conveniently go and train, makes it much more familiar for them. And it helps you really train specifically for that race course. The thing that I think sometimes people miss is, while it's great in terms of fitness, there are certain elements of riding a bike, especially for a lot of adult onset cyclists and triathletes, that you can't really simulate indoors. And I think being able to handle your bicycle, in crosswinds on rough road surfaces, being able to drink while your bike is moving, being able to eat while your bike is moving. I think all of these things are of great benefit also. So I think, if you want to do your quality sessions on the race course, in the comfort of your home, and I'll preface by saying in a really cool room with a big fan on, maybe a couple fans on, lots of fluid, I think that's great. But I don't think you should forego riding the bike outside. Try and simulate a course. If it's a hilly course, maybe go to SUNY Old Westbury or into Head of the Harbor, Nissequag. Try and ride on courses that are kind of specific to the race that you're going to do, because you'll get some training that's invaluable. So many times, especially around this time of the year, we start to get a lot of triathletes that are getting their wheels stuck in expansion grooves and falling. They're bumping into each other and getting hurt. You really need to learn how to handle your bike, how to handle it in those other elements where you're going to be drinking and eating. Plus, out on the road, there are changes in wind direction that make the power fluctuate a lot more than it will inside. So you kind of get used to always riding at like an ISO power, very tight range. Whereas outside on the road, it's much more realistic. So I think it's a great tool, but I think you need to get outside too. Yeah.
Let's switch gears to bike fitting. Okay, so why do you need a bike fitting? You buy a tri-bike, or even, I don't know if you even do it with a road bike, but why would you need one? Yeah.
Again, another really good question. I think a lot of this technology that goes into making the bicycles faster, enabling riders to cover the distance in their race quicker with less effort, a lot of that goes by the wayside if the bike doesn't fit properly. When people come to me with fits, especially people that come to me with fitting issues, perhaps they weren't fit on their bike, or they were fit maybe not quite well. The message that I try and convey to them is probably our number one goal is to put you on the bike in a position that you're not going to get injured. In other words, it's not going to cause any strains. It's going to take into account your level of flexibility and ability. So that when you're sitting on the bike, you're in a comfortable position, something that isn't going to cause tightness or other issues that could affect you on your cycling training, or could affect you in your run training. A lot of times we're kind of rehabilitating injuries. So in many cases, our biggest goal is to get the athlete on the bike so that they're supporting the majority of their weight with their skeletal system. I say this to people all the time. You want to be sitting on your sit bones. you want to be leaning over on your aero bars, supporting as much of your weight as you can with your skeletal system. If you're one of these athletes that find themselves sliding back and forth on the saddle, they're sliding forward, their neck hurts, their arms hurt, they can't stay in the aero bars, then you probably need a bike fit. You go to these races, and on closed courses, you'll see riders on a perfectly flat section into the wind riding up on the base bar because they're uncomfortable being in the aero bars. You should be in those aero bars as much as possible because they're not aero unless you're in them. You should be able to drink and eat from that position, which brings up the other really important element of bike fit. You really have to be in a position that not only are you comfortable and powerful, that you can get off the bike and not have exhausted the muscles that are going to run to be able to run well, but you also have to be in a position where you're balanced on the bike. You'll be safer, the bike will handle better. You'll feel more confident descending and ascending. A lot of times I'll get athletes that come in and say, I can go pretty fast on the flat, but as soon as I go into the hills on my tri bike, I can't keep up. And a lot of that is just poor fit.
Now, there's two things I want to ask you about. One, you alluded to flexibility. So I actually interviewed someone yesterday who wrote the book Women Who Try, Alicia DeFabio. And she told me that through her research, she found that women in their late 40s, 50s, and 60s are getting into triathlons. Now, talking about that, how does that, in terms of flexibility, does that change the way the person should be riding in aero through a bike fitting?
Yeah, the first off, I tend to agree with that just from the number of athletes that I see come into the shop. I would say probably 50% of the athletes that come in now are women, maybe a little bit more. And that kind of 40 and 50-year-old, my age group is probably growing faster than any other. The considerations with those athletes, again, it's their current fitness. You also want to look at where they might go down the road. In other words, you want to put them in a position that they can ride comfortably, safely, powerfully, and without getting injury now. But you want to keep in the back of your mind that as these athletes develop, if they, as their body changes, as they become a little bit stronger or become more flexible, regain some of the flexibility that they lost as they were, not exercising so much in the last few years, that they're still able to adjust the bike to get a little bit more aerodynamic. Certainly, if you look at someone who's a beginner triathlete, they may come in and not be able to ride in as aggressive position today as they might be in 3 years. To put them in the position that you think ideally they'll be in, or that they would have been in if they were a 25-year-old, professional triathlete is folly. You're gonna detract from their experience. They're gonna get injured. They're gonna be uncomfortable. They're gonna wonder why they're doing it. So, do we have athletes that come back all the time? Athletes that say, listen, I've been training really hard. I've been doing this for a couple years. This position's great. I feel really strong here. Let's see if I can get even a little bit more aerodynamic. See if I can get a little bit flatter. When I get flatter, do I have any issues with losing power? You start to decrease the demand side. The supply side is how much power you can put out. The demand side is how easy is it for you to go through air? How fast can you go through air? So with those athletes, we want to put them on something now that fits their flexibility and their ability level now and their strength. But we also want to keep in mind that down the road that they're going to get better. They're going to want to be able to get a little bit lower or narrow or whatever.
Let's talk about people. I was telling you the other day when we were, doing a trial that I met a person who was on a bike, and it just looked like she was on the wrong bike. She was a relatively short woman like myself, about 5'2", 5'3". She was on a 53-inch bike. I'm on a 48, so I knew right away it didn't look right, and her feet didn't never touch the ground. Like she was like this, like, there was about this much space between her foot and the ground. So what what would you suggest in that regard, about somebody? I mean, how do you know when to buy the right bike, or, to get the right fitting?
I think probably the sometimes it's a little bit difficult afterward, like if she is your size and she's on a 53 or 54 centimeter bike, there's no adjusting that so that it fits. But what I would suggest that athletes do is ask themselves, am I able to ride for long periods of time in the aero bars comfortably? When I'm leaning over on the aero bars, do I have what I call TV arms? Can I just lean over with very relaxed muscles and, do I want to spend all day there? Am I able to sit firmly in the saddle without rocking? Does my back hurt? Do my calves hurt? Do I have any kind of issues with my IT band or my knees, my neck? If the answer is yes to those questions about discomfort, then perhaps you should seek out, someone that's experienced to fit you. I don't think that, I think sometimes what happens is people see a really good value maybe that they see used on the internet maybe or something, and they don't do enough research, and they wind up with a bike that probably doesn't fit. There are also some fitters that have some different ideas on how people should be fit. And I usually tell people, you probably wouldn't put yourself in that position if you were setting up your bike, because you wouldn't be comfortable. So, I would ask myself those questions. If you're not able to spend long periods of time in the aero bars, if you find yourself, sliding all the way forward to try and reach the pedals when you start to pedal hard, or you're sliding back and forth on the saddle, moving around because you're not comfortable where you're sitting, you're getting any kind of numbness, then come down and we'll talk about it.
Now, that gives me another question. Okay, so there are some people that have these very high-tech machines where they put you on a machine and you're there for like 2 hours or 3 hours or whatever, and so talk to me about that versus I know how you do it. You're more like an type of person, because I got my bike fitting from you and I'm very happy with it. But talk to me about that. Like, is there really a difference? I mean, should you use the machine? Should you go to somebody who could just, look at you and figure out what's right?
I think the fitting software and the motion capture machine, like we have a specialized body geometry system here at Babylon Bike. It's something that I've used on some occasions when an athlete wants to have like a record of the fitting. They want to see where they were. They want to be kind of part of it and say, listen, show me where I am before and show me where I am after. But for myself, I find sometimes that again, it's just a tool. It's something. It's helping me see things that I can see with my eyes. It's effective for pointing things out sometimes to the athlete, but rather than set the body geometry system up, I'll show them a video on their phone, and then they'll have it all the time on their phone. They can look at where they were and where they are now. And because a tool, it's something that some people know how to use really well. And just by virtue of having the tool doesn't mean it is necessarily going to be better. Certainly, I could buy a CAT scan machine, read up on the internet about taking CAT scans, and I probably shouldn't be allowed to do that. Yeah, I mean, I think it can help. I think it's a tool, but there are some fitters that I'd much rather have them look at me with their naked eye than have some others look at me with all the software. You got to know what you're looking at. You got to understand what you're looking at.
Interesting. I have a question, because while we're sitting here, you've got a team in training. jersey behind you.
Sure.
And Team in Training is actually now a sponsor of We Are Triathletes, and we're very happy to have them as a sponsor. So tell us about your experience.
So many, many years ago, probably even before I started training with Power, I came into contact with a couple people from Team in Training who asked me to get involved with the cycling team. Maybe we were doing some outdoor clinics up at Sunken Meadow. We would do some clinics over in Heckscher, things like drafting, shifting their bikes, fixing flat tires. Then we would have usually once or twice a season, they would come into the shop and we would do a flat fixer clinic here, or we would talk about indoor training, or we would talk about buying the right clothing to train in the wintertime. And that just kind of blossomed from there. So, we're still big supporters of Team in Training. They're just great group of people. George Fasinelli and now Kathy Keelitz-Williamson are probably the ones that got us involved in it right from the get-go.
Very cool. Well, I'm just going to say if, Nicole is on, I don't know, Nicole, if you have any questions. Nicole Thomas is on our board of advisors at We Are Triathletes. I see she had jumped on, so I wanted to know if she has any questions for you.
I'm not sure. I've been trying to train with Power for a year or more. I know my coach looks at the data, but he doesn't really give me feedback on the Power. So I'm just wondering, how much I should care.
What I think would be a really, really good thing, and I know as a coach, and as you can probably tell just from the way I'm answering questions here, I tend to run along a little bit at the mouth. I like talking about this stuff. I would imagine your coach probably got into it because they like talking about this stuff. So it's probably just something where you want to ask a little bit, just ask some questions like, what are you looking for in the workout that I did? Or like, I love it when someone asks me, why am I doing this workout? It's like, where does this fit in to the training plan? Or I love it, when, as I go along, I hope I'm pointing out improvements over certain sessions. I'll say, listen, this is an effort that, you're 10% higher than you were, 12 weeks ago. I like to have that conversation with athletes. And really the Power for me is a big component of really understanding how much stress is being applied to the athlete. That's kind of the dose. If I ask you to do a certain interval set, it has a certain amount of stress and it takes a certain amount of time to recover. And I base what I'm going to ask you to do later in the day or the next day on how you respond to that stress. And it's always being adjusted. So, it's probably something that they're tracking really carefully, but it's probably something they don't know that you're interested in. So let your coach know that it's something that you think is really cool.
That's probably what I have to do. My coach isn't the most hands-on guy. If you don't seek the knowledge from him, he doesn't necessarily impart it. So that's a good tip. I just have to.
Because some people tell me, just tell me what to hold and I'll hold it. But I think a lot of times, with the power output that I ask an athlete to hold comes another measure, and usually that's perceived exertion. So if I ask you to hold 200 watts for 5 minutes, there's a difference if it feels easy or if it feels like you turned yourself inside out to do it. And having that communication between you guys or you folks is an important part of the training. Like how hard it is to do it is as important as whether or not you were able to do it. So definitely, strike up that conversation. I'm sure it's something that they'd really like to talk about.
Okay. Is power something I should be monitoring while I'm outdoors on a ride, or just something I should be looking back afterwards to see what I was doing?
That's a super question, Nicole. It's never anything you want to distract you from the conditions of the road. You never want to, be looking down at a number and then go into an expansion groove or, God forbid, roll through an intersection, right? But for certain types of rides, I might have athletes, glance over at their average power or their normalized power to see where they are, to make sure perhaps they don't go out too hard early on. And certainly, if you're doing outdoor intervals, if you're doing efforts at or above race intensity, then you want to use it. You want to use it to monitor how hard you're going. Lake Placid is coming up this Sunday, and the athletes that I have that are doing that race, they've done lots of riding at and around the power output that they're going to aim to hold on the course on Sunday. But I have the conversation with all of them several times, and I'll have it again on Saturday up at Placid. You have to expect the power meter to stop working on Sunday morning. Pretend that you don't have it now. So don't be so dependent upon it that if it doesn't work, you lose your mind. You know how hard it's supposed to feel come race day. So, if you're going into Ironman Lake Placid, for example, I have athletes that are going to try and hold 140 watts, we'll say, for 112 miles. So they're going into that effort, and they know that for them, 140 watts feels pretty easy. The idea is that they've trained really hard so that when they're riding easy, they're still going fast because they have that marathon afterwards. That's what you're riding your bike 112 miles to the start of a marathon. So if we get to Sunday and the weather forecast changes, instead of being kind of cloudy with a chance of rain, it becomes 100 degrees. Well, 140 watts then is going to be much too hard. So they're prepared at that point to default back to their perceived exertion. And instead of doing 140, they might do 120 or 115. Because if they go to 140, that's always a governor. They can never go harder than that, even under ideal conditions. But if they need to correlate that perceived exertion so that it still feels easy, they're going to go much easier if they have to. So it's the kind of thing that, I always give athletes a governor. I'm going to, because I'll say to you, listen, Nicole, you've been training, you've been rested, you're tapered, you're ready to go. This power output that you're going to hold is going to feel kind of easy in the beginning. Don't be tempted to go too hard, because going 10 or 20 watts too hard in an Ironman will save you 3 to 6 minutes. That's it. But if you walk an extra mile that you could have been even jogging, you can give back all that time that you gained in 1 mile in a marathon. Usually it's much, much more than that. So, we want to see you running something that's representative of your running ability. There's no point, I mentioned to Hillary before, there's no point in having a, quote unquote, great bike and then having a terrible run. It's much better to ride conservatively and run well. You'll pass a lot more people.
One more question, I think. Given a Garmin, let's say, with 4 data fields on your bike, what 4 fields do you think is most important to see?
In training or racing, you think?
How about both?
Well, in training, I would probably have time. I would have current power. A lot of people like speed. For some athletes, they like to see heart rate also. For athletes that like to have their heart rate, I'll put that on there. In a race, I would probably take distance out, and I would probably insert something called normalized power. Because on a course with a variety of terrain, you don't ride at a super steady effort. You ride a little bit above and a little below the goal power. You ride a little bit above the goal power on the slow parts, like uphill. And then on the downhill parts, on the fast parts, you go a little bit easier to kind of pay back. You kind of think, well, I want to hold 140 watts as my norm power for Ironman. So going up the climbs, you might hold 155. But that means on all those downhills, you have to be holding below 120 so that normalized power kind of comes back out to 140. So that would probably be the one that I would substitute for distance, because distance is everywhere on the course. You know how far you are. There are markers.
I find it interesting you're not interested in speed or cadence at all, it sounds like.
No, that's a great point. And that's what I tell people. That 140 watt effort that I was just talking about for that, that athlete, it's going to elicit a time that's going to be somewhere between 6:15 and about 6:40. And you take what the day gives you. If you go out there and try and maintain a speed, and it turns out that it's a slow day, you're going to be going too hard. But if you go the effort that you can hold for that range, you're going to take what the day gives you. It might be a 6:15 if it's a nice, cool, calm day, or it might be 6:40 if it's a very windy day. Like If you have a wind coming up the Bears in Lake Placid, it's going to be a slow day. You're going to have the wind in your face for a lot of the race. So you ride as hard as you can. I shouldn't say as hard as you can, as hard as you should. And you're satisfied with whatever that time winds up being. So speed becomes irrelevant at that point.
Mhm.
You know what's interesting? Actually, Nicole brings up a really good point in terms of the cadence, right? So like some people say you should go 90 in terms or above on cadence, right? And then you also have, you know, when you're working with power, you could be going 60, 70 in terms of cadence.
Sure.
So talk to us about that. I mean, should we be concerned about the cadence and the power?
This is another one of my favorite questions to answer. So the cadence is very individual, and a lot of it has to do with the power output that you're holding. So for your so I shouldn't say typical, for your average middle of the pack triathlete or back of the pack triathlete, what is optimal for them tends to be much lower than 90 RPMs. So I think 90 RPMs is something that kind of arose from looking at really elite triathletes and how fast they pedal. If you look at male triathletes, they tend to pedal 90, 95 RPMs. Very few of them are in the 80s. Unless you look at the women triathletes who tend to ride at a little bit lower power output because of their size. They're more often in the 80 range or even in the 70s. So what I tell athletes to do is you want to seek out the cadence that makes the power that you're trying to hold feel the easiest. The power that feels the cadence that makes your goal power feel the easiest is your optimal cadence in that particular power output. So if you're trying to hold 150 watts, your ideal cadence might be 80 RPMs. If you're trying to hold 200 watts, it might be 100 RPMs. But what you need to do is play around with the cadence, shift your gears, and see, does it get easier when I pedal faster, or does it get easier when I pedal slower? And invariably, that'll be what's best for you. To try and hold a cadence that's much higher, or because that's what most people are doing, they're trying to hold 90 to 100. That's very, very inefficient. Now, it's different when you're running. I mean, when you're running, you do want to have a high run cadence. You want to have it in the mid 80s to low to mid 90s. But on a bike, it's very individual. You know, an average age grouper might pedal 70 to 75, and a professional male might be 95 to 100. So, yeah, so definitely cadence is something that you should play with. Understand where you are on that that continuum, and then you know, always be looking to minimize the perceived exertion, make it feel the easiest. Yeah.
Great. All right. Well, I think with that, I'm going to wrap this up. I want to thank you so much, Mike. Mike is from Babylon Bikes in Babylon. And I want to thank Mike for being here to give us a webinar. And we're going to, next week, we'll be actually having Jeff Galloway on the show for our webinar. So stay tuned to that. And thank you again, Mike. And without further ado, I'm going to tune out.
Thanks for inviting me.